a vice president for Aramco whose name was Floyd Oliger. And he was with the king one time, and the king was tired, he was sick. And so Oliger said to him, "Your Majesty, why don't you go out into the desert, do a little hunting and relax, and we have a wonderful guest house." So they thought that was a good idea. When the king landed, one of the things they were unloading from the plane was liqueur and hard whiskey. Well, we took a look at this, and where did they put the stuff? They put the stuff under the king's bed in the guest house. So of course, we were kind of shocked. And during the stay, we could see that they would drink this stuff straight. But it was kept very quiet.
King Saud's drinking was kept quiet in part because the king was an important asset for the Americans. Since Gamal Abdel Nasser's overthrow of the King of Egypt in 1952, the balance of power in the region had changed. Nasser aligned himself with the Soviet Union and proclaimed himself a socialist and pan-Arabist. For both Saudi Arabia and America, this was a threat.
The Cold War was at its peak, where you had two mighty empires battling out across the whole planet, destroying nations in their path. And you had the end of colonialism and these newly liberated countries coming out full of vitality, full of energy, and wanting to prove themselves. And the theme was out with the old, in with the new. Who cares whether the old was good or bad? It doesn't matter. We want to change. Khalas, we want to change and get everything new. So in this kind of environment, we are who are quintessentially old. You know what I mean? We were the odd ones out. We were going against the trend.
We did not want to be part of that new thinking in terms of socialism, communism. We've already had our ism. We've already had Islam. We were happy, and we united around Islam. And anything that would have come to Saudi Arabia would have unraveled the country.
Nasser wanted Saudi oil under his control, saying it belonged to all Arab peoples. The Americans moved to shore up support for King Saud.
Saudi Arabia is absolutely a linchpin, a key to our relationship in the whole area. So oil is at the very center of that, and Russian power coming down there and having control of those oil fields would have been a major, major blow to us.
The Eisenhower administration had the idea that perhaps King Saud could be built up in a political fashion that might make him a contender with Nasser in terms of leadership in the Arab world.
The White House said, we are inviting His Majesty and 8 of his retinue. And we took that to the king, and particularly to his advisors. They looked at us and we looked at them, and there was going to be no way it would only be 8. Well, one thing led to another, and by the time they got on the ship, there were about 80.
After arriving in New York, King Saud and his entourage flew to Washington. Saud became the first Saudi monarch invited to America on a state visit.
Eisenhower met him at the airport, which was very, very unusual, and he just determined that he was going to treat Saud as his great good friend.
Eisenhower wanted a renewal of the lease on the Dhahran Air Base, a useful strategic asset in the Cold War. King Saud wanted the money that the U.S. would pay to extend the lease.
My father at the time, was negotiating the agreement. He was very sensitive to not calling it a base. It was a transit place for the Americans to take fueling, period.
The exact details of the Dhahran Agreement are revealed in this original copy of the accord. This agreement constitutes, until today, the basis of U.S.-Saudi military cooperation.
In exchange for our free use of the Dhahran airfield, they wanted all kinds of materials. They wanted tanks, for one thing, and they wanted training, and they wanted planes, and they wanted anything we would give them.
The agreement was celebrated with great pomp. King Saud was given full honors.
The official visit was glittering and fine, but when it was all over, one sort of felt, you know, what is this all about? Because he's clearly not the man for this.
Eisenhower's plan to build up Saud as the alternative Arab leader seemed doomed to fail. King Saud spent much of the money from the Dhahran lease on luxury trips to Europe. A rift was fast developing in the family.
His extravagance wasn't the big issue. Kings can be extravagant and still remain king. The big issue was the running of the government. That was the biggest problem. It was all personal.
We were really worried about Saudi Arabia. I mean, I'm not talking just about Aramco. I'm talking about the people in the U.S. government and everybody were worried about Saudi Arabia, and we realized that if anybody was going to save Saudi Arabia, it was going to be Faisal. And a lot of people worried, as we did, living in Riyadh, that there'd be a kind of a civil war.
The Al Saud brothers realized that something had to be done.
The step of removing a monarch is something that is not lightly taken by anyone. It is a very serious, very dangerous step. Removing one monarch, well, you can always remove another.
So the brothers all got together, all of them. It was their own best interest. They had to make a move. And they decided in November of '64 to go to the religious leaders, and they decided this is the way they could do it.
And they got a fatwa from the religious leaders sanctioning the abdication and sanctioning Faisal's taking over the throne.
Once more, the Saudi monarchy was saved from the brink of disaster by the ulama.
The family decision to depose Saud in the 1960s was really more of a turning point than the death of Abdulaziz in 1953, because it was finally coming into the modern world, but also proving that the desert democracy of sitting around the campfire and the family picking the toughest man for the job could work in the 20th century, and the speed with which the change was actually accomplished and the new direction that the country took. That, I think, was the decisive turning point in the history of Saudi Arabia in the middle of the 20th century.
King Saud and his entourage were quietly asked to leave the country. The ailing Saudi monarch spent his last years exiled in Athens, Greece.
It was my first year at Georgetown, 1964. I was called in by the dean of the university, who, when I went in the office, I thought I had done something wrong or something. And he said, well, now Turkey, and your situation has changed, and are you thinking that perhaps we could provide you with some bodyguards? In those days, there was no internet, there was no instant news service. I had absolutely no idea that on that day, Monday, that my father had become king.
King Faisal had a lot to do. But almost every aspect of bringing the kingdom up to date was bound to bring him into conflict with the ulama. In their view, every innovation threatened Islam.
Essentially, modernity means westernization. This is the fact. It's like a buzzword. Okay? Modern means westernized. This is where we have problems because people want to run their lives better, but not necessarily sacrificing their own culture and their own history in order to become copies of Frenchmen or copies of the English or false Americans. They don't want that.
He decided that there should be girls' schools in Saudi Arabia, and there was an uproar about it. All the old fathers came along and said this was awful. Who knew what would happen when the girls got education? And Faisal said, in that case, don't send your daughters to the schools. And if you don't want, if a majority of people in your village or town don't want a girls' school, you won't have one. But those who do want to have a school must have one.
I would have been illiterate if they didn't have schools at the time. And in fact, I was lucky to go to one of the early private schools that were established in the 60s. Female education was put under the directory of a separate body that would control the curriculum and make sure that what the girls are taught in schools is actually suitable for them as girls and as women. So in that way, he managed to reconcile the need for female education and also the requirements of the ulama.
Gradually, indeed, the number of girls' schools was increased, and then girls were admitted to universities and so on. All this was done by keeping just a little way ahead of public opinion and always being willing to stop and wait for public opinion to catch up.
But reaching compromise with the ulama was a constant battle. Leading Wahhabi clerics were ever vigilant.
One day, I get a telephone call from our people in Dhahran and says, Mike, they're banning vanilla. The vanilla extract is being banned. I said, why? He said, well, it's got a little alcohol in it. And you know, they're going crazy. Now, anything with anything, any alcohol in it, anything. And they're saying to me, look, we can't make ice cream, we can't make bread, we can't make cakes, we can't go on. It's a big problem. We've got to do something about it. So, I happened to be in one of my visits to the king, and I was telling him about this, and he was amazing. He was amazing, really. He picks up the phone, and the vanilla was allowed in.
But to keep the peace with conservatives, King Faisal made Saudi Arabia a sanctuary for extremist Muslims from abroad. When governments in Egypt and Syria cracked down on fundamentalist religious scholars, King Faisal invited them to teach Saudi Arabian youth. Faisal's decision had far-reaching consequences.
There was an influx of them here, and where did they work? They worked in the education and in other professional works, and that's when the problem started here.
Many of today's Saudi radicals studied under Egyptian and Syrian fundamentalists.
They misused their hospitality. We dealt with them honestly, and they dealt with that with us underhandedly, and that's a mistake that's not going to be repeated.
Religious conservatives staged one of their biggest protests in 1965, when Faisal approved TV broadcasts in the kingdom.
They considered that broadcasting television is a sin and against, because they consider them to be images. And we're not supposed to show images. And they considered that this was rank heresy and that the government had become in league with the devil.
So what he did is he had somebody recite the Quran and broadcast that and told people, you see this? It's like a sword. You can use a sword for good, or you can use the sword to assassinate. So it's a tool, really. It's like the internet today. The same debate goes on.
A nephew of the king sided with religious conservatives. It would eventually have drastic personal consequences.